Dr. Ryan has joined me today to talk about his book chapter titled Zones at Sea and the Properties of Connectivity, in which he argues that global space is made up of an interconnected system of enclosures, which are constituted of three spheres of political existence: the human, the state, and the non-human domains, and how these zones of governance encapsulate state power in a definitively zonal world. Before we delve into this interesting topic, I would like to ask you to tell me about your own background a little bit and how it is you came to write for a book centered around the topic of connectivity. What is the connection there?
Well, I'm a theorist of international relations and in particular security studies. And what interests me most, of course, is the security of space and of maritime space. I've been working on for the last few years, and I'm still working on it, kind of a political theory of space at sea and how space is generated, what its functions, aims, and how it develops. And so for the last couple of years then, empirically, I've been looking at maritime enclosures, maritime zones. These are the newest form of spatial governance we have on the planet. And I've just been fascinated by them and how they're developing. And that's how I got into this idea of connectivity. And it leads me, I suppose, if you like, the basis or the origin of my interest or my perspective on spatial governance comes from a kind of an old, they call it perceptual geometry. And it's an old idea from, I suppose, the 1960s that the phenomenologists were looking at. And the basic idea was that a human individual lives in a kind of a 360-degree perceptual zone or horizon, in which we are limited by our perceptions, and there's a certain range to our perceptions. And that's the world we live in, and that's embedded in our language and our practices. You know, we live around here, we walk around, these are our surroundings. And the theory then that I'm trying to develop is to what extent then the attributes or the qualities of this zone that we live in, this personal ontology that we exist in, how is it replicated by the state? How is it replicated? Firstly, you know, when we built our first homes, what was the attributes of that? When we built forts, castles, cities, estates, and then states. And so the challenge of the piece on connectivity was, I was thinking, well, what are the attributes of this personal zone that we may find in the replication of this zone, in the kind of plastic zone that's created by state governance? And also, of course, there was the other issue of the non-human kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the ontology of their zones and the political vitality that's created by the zones that they exist in. And so the theory of space that I'm beginning to develop, if you like, in this chapter, looks at how these are connected and these are linked. The individual ontology, the state epistemology of zonation, and the ontology of non-human zonation. And that then constitutes for me what international politics and international relations or global politics should actually be about.
Right, so you touch on a lot of topics from your chapter there, which is good. And then I was wondering if we take it back to the start of this kind of thinking is, you mentioned how we cannot escape zonal existence, how this will to zone is how we make sense of the world. And I was wondering if you have any idea why this is. Is it evolutionarily advantageous? Is it some kind of path dependency? Do you have ideas?
It's fascinating. Like, we go back to that idea of the perceptual geometry. And that's what I was tracing in some of the chapter. I was going back to old Norse poetry and old Anglo-Saxon and Celtic poetry. And when we find the word zone, and we find different derivations of the word zone throughout that poetry, and even in my own language in Irish, you know, I still see the word, it's kris. A zone is a kris, and a kris is a belt. And so that got me thinking about, how primordial this is. Is this, you know, this is what those phenomenologists in the 60s, these perceptual geometry people, this is what they were arguing, that this is the way we experience and encounter the world, you know, as a roundness. And what's fascinating then is then the three attributes that I pick up on this, that gives us a sense of aroundness, which gives us a sense of I suppose, of scale in the world. And it gives us that sense of immunity. It gives us that sense of certainty, of security. We know our familiar surroundings. And it gives us that liquidity, that this zone is highly, it can move around, So if you were designing then a form of spatial governance, no form of spatial governance is natural. Everything has been constructed. But what you're doing then is you're constructing, you're taking out those qualities that give ontological security to an individual human being, and you're saying, right, I need to create these qualities in a wider horizon, where many different individuals living in their own zones can live in this wider zone and then share this sense of immunity, the sense of shared identity. And so, I think then that we can, if there is a kind of an evolution, we see that evolution. The work of Lewis Mumford is interesting here in his history of the city. He traces it traces the city from to the state. That there is this evolution, political evolution, to the idea of larger enclosures, creating the certainty, creating the security. And then what we're doing at sea then is we've got a new materiality. We're not working on land anymore. And so when we want to recreate those ontological zones, we're working on an entirely different material that we cannot, much more difficult to bring in those attributes and qualities. And so what we see in the zones and seas, we don't have this emphasis as much on sovereignty, but the emphasis is far more on connectivity, on routinization and movement, and freedom, and the liquidity of the zone. So, to answer the question, there's nothing natural about these zones, these epistemological zones, but there is perhaps, tentatively, something natural about our own human zones and our own personal zones that I'm arguing for these, that we exist in.
I see. The way you describe this kind of thinking, it makes me think of the animal kingdom and the way different animals establish their own territories and kind of move around within this, let's call it a zone, that they think is rightfully theirs, differentiated from other animal zones or even from the same species, perhaps. And I find it interesting also, you mentioned, obviously, the fundamental difference between the land and the sea as a space. And I think it makes sense since nobody permanently inhabits the sea, obviously. And I think you explained it a little bit already, but where do the fundamental differences lie in thinking about the sea versus land as objects of the human imaginary? Is it this kind of space we cannot seem to, let's call it colonize, as opposed to land we cannot settle? Is this the difference?
Well, if you look at the history, the history of political theory on the sea, starting, even if we start with Grotius, Hugo Grotius, for his entire political economy that he was establishing, so a space, he had to separate land and sea. Mm-hmm. He had to create a contrived distinction between land and sea because he wanted sea to have a certain function, which was an economic function, where that Dutch traders could go down to the south and trade and move up and down. So it was going to be a zone of freedom.
Yeah.
And that zone of freedom was very, very different than the kind of freedom that existed on land. Mm-hmm. And so this idea persisted, and it became a real challenge, it became a real problem to those who were arguing for a different sort of regime on the sea, the likes of Selden's, Mare Clausen, or other theorists who were looking at, because from Grotius onwards, people were trying to think, well, how do we recreate sovereignty? How do we recreate private property? How do we bring liberalism to this turbulent, chaotic, constantly moving environment? And it really isn't until we get to the 1980s with, I suppose, the technological innovations that were there, with the cartographical, the advent of GPS, that these zones were able to be, if you like, a matrix of zonal governance was able to be more properly laid over the sea than was previously. And this gave, in many ways, this recreated many of those, Selden's idea of mare clausum, and other theorists who want to get rid of this idea of a communal sea and actually start working to work on the sea and harvest the sea in an efficient way through the use of enclosure.
So you would say that over time, different people have thought about the sea as a space and have theorized it differently, and we seem to have arrived at a stage where sea, to some extent, has become part of land as far as nation states are concerned. And so I think also, as opposed to land, in the space of the sea, we have a lot of strides to make. So what do you think lies in the future for the governance of the sea?
We're in very, very early days of this. So UNCLOS was 1982. It wasn't ratified until, was it 1991, 92? And we've only seen littoral states claim their exclusive economic zones over the last 10 or 20 years. And firstly, all they did was claim them. They didn't start working them. We're only seeing now the implementation of blue economies. We're seeing the likes of states trying to stretch and harden the borders of these exclusive zones. And we're seeing a new kind of state politics happen on the sea. Mm-hmm. So we're at very, very early days. My feeling is that we are looking at a kind of a territorialization of sea space, that the idealistic idea of freedom of sea, which is only a military commercial freedom anyway, is being, the sea has become a much more valuable resource. And in a sense, that's really interesting, because it's going to start forcing people who study politics to study the sea. For a very long time, we've been kind of guided by this legal principle that was established in 1971, that the land dominates the sea, and that may be what's happening here, the land dominating the sea legally and economically. But geologically, in terms of climate change, in terms of history, the sea has played an enormous, has had enormous impact in the history of humankind. And the sea in many ways dominates humankind outside the realm of law and economics. And so one of the things I think that we're going to see occurring is a turn, if you like, towards the maritime sphere, a deeper understanding and appreciation of the role the sea has played in the history of humankind.
Absolutely. And so do you think this territorialization, will it be a sort of law of the jungle, where the strongest, biggest country simply claims what they will? Let's take, for example, China in the Spratly Islands. I think perhaps you were hinting at this as well. Of course, it's very interesting to see such a, well, it's not a land grab, obviously, but that's what it feels like, so far out outside of its own borders. What do you think?
I know it's an interesting, it's not just China doing this, it's happening in South America. Australia have a zone they call the identification zone, which stretches all the way to Indonesia, which has no place either in international law. Yes, the politics of the sea increasingly, I think, are going to be located on the limits, on these borders, on the possibilities of stretching these borders, because of the tremendous wealth that is accorded to you when you have exclusive access to the space within that. And so that's where we're going to see a lot of maritime politics happening. And of course, that's going to have huge effects on land politics as well, on the limits, on the borders. These were meant to be soft borders under UNCLOS, but they are hardening, and more laws are applied to them as we go along. And it's kind of a soft law as well. It's difficult as well. So it's highly political spaces. It's really interesting when I look at the kind of people, when I write about the sea and write about the law of the sea. It's fascinating. It always gets me that it's people living in the global south have a much keener sense of the impact on the sea on their lives than people in the global north. That my work is read a great deal more by people living in the global south than the global north, because they feel it much more so than we do here in Europe, I think.
Interesting. It's also good you mentioned law there. I'm going to read you a quote from your chapter, and then I'll ask you a question. So, towards the end, you say, the study of IR, if it is to remain relevant, must stop simply critiquing the symbolic order of the map and begin connecting it with local spaces of human imagination and non-human experience. To me, this seems a call for a more localized and ecologically aware form of political theorizing. So, are you a proponent of international law safeguarding the rights of the environment? Think of the work on simian rights, environmental law, etc. Will we make strides in this in the 21st century, or do you not see this happening?
It's a very good question. Like, I'm no expert in environmentalism, nor am I an expert in international law.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the way rights are distributed in such a biopolitical manner between humans, rights are distributed according to race and gender and class and whatever. I just wonder, will we, if we extended those rights to the animal kingdom, will we be giving certain rights to the fish? The fish we don't like to eat won't be getting as many rights as the fish we do like to eat,
Mm-hmm.
or vice versa. So I think what that called for is not so much, and again, the likes of Jane Bennett and Bruno Latour, who are looking for these non-hierarchical relationships between the human and the non-human world. That's very valid, and that's very central to my argument, and that's a lot of my argument is built on that. But if I was to take a more generalized, make a more generalized point, is that social sciences, and humanities, we've done fantastic work at building knowledge of humans and human life and human relations. But we know nothing, very, very little about non-human life and non-human relations, and the political vitality. We're only beginning to recognize the political vitality that is there and that impacts us. And climate change, of course, is one of those great forces that's advising us on this. So when I was writing that article, and in particular when I was writing the part at the end about the non-human zones, these ontological zones that non-humans live in, I found that there was very little research on the kind of zones that animals live in. There was only, I think I found maybe 4 studies on different species. And one of the studies was on this wolf habitat, and it was fascinating that they lived in these circles and that their circles were interconnecting. So if I was to make a kind of a general point, it would be that social sciences and humanities needs to work closer with the natural sciences. We can't have this distinction in the university between these two faculties on one side and working away in their own realms. If we are truly to solve these problems of the world, they need to come together. We need to begin working together and sharing knowledge and information. They have the information about the non-human world. We have the information about the human world. We have the information about ethics. They have the data. And that's something I think that, going forward, if you like, what the university and the academia needs to start thinking much more about.
I think that's an excellent point to finish on. Dr. Ryan, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully until next time.
Great, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.